In the pack of Silver Hollow, there was a young woman named Felicia Crawford. She kept the records. She wrote down births, deaths, landlines, and old promises between families. She was quiet, careful, and kind. The kind of person elders trusted and children liked to sit near. But for 23 days, Felicia Crawford did not sit down. Not at meals, not during council gatherings, not even alone in her own room at night. Every time someone noticed her pale face, or the way her hands shook when she leaned on the long oak counter of the records hall, she gave the same quiet answer. "It hurts when I sit," she said it softly, almost like an apology. And every time she said it, the person standing in front of her found a reason to look somewhere else. At the floor, at the window, at anything that was not her face. The pack had a story ready, and they repeated it the way people repeat something they want to believe. Felicia had fallen during a training drill near the old patrol grounds. A simple accident, a careless step in the dark. But Felicia remembered things the story did not include. She remembered a cold smile that did not belong to a friend. She remembered the sound of a clasp snapping off a cloak and falling into the dirt beside her. She remembered the healer, Rebecca Daniels, writing one word in the medical ledger without once looking up. And she remembered her own mother, standing in a doorway, eyes full of tears, saying nothing at all. Then a stranger walked into the records hall. He was an alpha king from another territory, there for nothing more than formal talks about borders and trade. His name was Leonard Whitaker, and he was not supposed to notice a quiet records keeper nodding behind a counter. But he did. He looked at her once, and something in him went still. Because Leonard had spent his whole life learning how to read a room, and this room was lying to him. This is her story, and his. A story about a pack that chose comfort over truth, and one alpha who chose to ask the question nobody else was brave enough to ask. The wind that morning carried the first true bite of autumn, the kind that made the older wolves talk about an early winter, and the younger ones pull their cloaks tighter without complaint. Silver Hollow had spent days preparing for the Alpha King's arrival, sweeping the main hall, polishing the long table where the council met, gathering food enough to make a good impression on a guest who, by most accounts, held influence across 3 territories. Nobody had spent those same days preparing the truth. The truth had simply been folded away, tucked beneath a story about a careless fall, and tucked further still, beneath the comfortable belief that some questions were better left unasked. The morning air in Silver Hollow smelled like wet pine and wood smoke. Inside the records hall, the fire had only just been lit, and the cold still clung to the stone floor. Felicia Crawford stood behind the long oak counter, sorting through a stack of border agreements that had not been touched in months. She moved slowly, carefully, every motion measured, the way a person moves when their body has learned to expect pain and is trying to outsmart it. The hall was still mostly empty at this hour, just the crackle of the fire and the occasional creak of the old wooden beams settling against the cold. Felicia liked these early minutes best, before the rest of the pack arrived and she had to begin the careful work of performing wellness for an audience. In the quiet, she could let her shoulders drop, let her breath come a little shallower than usual, let her face rest without the practiced smile she had learned to keep ready at all times. It was the only honesty she allowed herself most days. This small window before the hall filled, and the performance had to begin again. Her fingers found the edge of the counter and pressed down, just enough to steady herself, just enough that nobody watching would notice the small tremor running through her arm. She had gotten good at that. 23 days of practice had taught her how to hide a great deal. She lifted a stack of birth records and set them gently on the shelf behind her, and as she turned, a sharp pull of pain moved through her, low and deep, the kind that stole her breath for half a second before she caught it again. She held onto the shelf until it passed. Then she smiled, because Paige Hawkins had just walked through the door, and Paige was watching her. Paige had been her friend since they were children, chasing each other through the training yard, 2 girls who used to share secrets under the old oak tree near the river. Paige's eyes moved over Felicia's face, then down to her hands gripping the shelf, and for one moment, something honest passed between them. It was the kind of look that used to mean everything between them. A silent question and a silent promise to listen, exchanged 100 times over the years, without needing words at all. Felicia remembered countless afternoons spent exactly this way, trading glances across a crowded room before slipping away together to talk freely, away from prying ears. She found herself, for one brief moment, hoping that old understanding might still hold, that Paige might finally ask the real question instead of the safe one. "You look tired," Paige said. "I didn't sleep well," Felicia answered. It was not a lie. She had not slept well in 23 days. But it was not the whole truth either, and both of them knew it. Paige opened her mouth like she wanted to ask something else, something real. But then her gaze flicked toward the doorway, where Brittany Ramsey and Kelsey Gallagher stood whispering to each other, pretending they were not watching the same scene unfold. "I should get the council ledgers ready," Paige said instead, and she walked past the counter without waiting for an answer. Felicia watched her go, and felt the familiar ache settle into her chest, a different kind of pain than the one in her body. The pain of being seen, and still being left alone. She picked up the next stack of papers. Her hands trembled around the edges, and a record slipped, sliding off the counter. She bent to retrieve it, and the movement sent a flash of pain so sharp through her that she had to grip the wood with both hands and breathe through her teeth until it eased. "It hurts when I sit," she whispered to no one, because saying it out loud, even to an empty room, made it feel a little less like something she had to carry alone. She thought, not for the first time, about how strange it was that a body could keep score so honestly when the people around her refused to. Her body did not pretend. It did not smile politely and change the subject. It simply hurt, every hour, in a way that made forgetting impossible, even when forgetting was exactly what everyone around her seemed to want her to do. She remembered being a small girl in this same hall, trailing behind her mother, while Courtney delivered messages to the old records keeper, a kind woman named Hester, who let Felicia sit on a tall stool and trace her fingers over maps of territories she had never seen. Felicia used to imagine herself walking those distant roads one day, carrying her own ledger, her own name written somewhere important. She had never imagined this version of the records hall, the one where she counted hours instead of dreams, where her job had quietly become not just keeping the pack's history, but keeping her own pain small enough that nobody would have to look at it directly. The fire in the hearth popped and settled, sending a small shower of sparks up into the chimney, and Felicia watched it for a moment, grateful for anything that gave her eyes somewhere safe to rest. The official story moved through Silver Hollow, the way water moves through a riverbed, finding every low place and filling it without resistance. Felicia had been hurt in a training accident near the old patrol grounds. A careless fall in poor light, an unfortunate mistake. Nobody asked why a records keeper, who had no reason to be near the patrol grounds after dark, would have been out there at all. Nobody asked why the injury kept her from sitting for over 3 weeks, when a simple fall rarely did such lasting damage. Nobody asked, because asking meant looking at Bradley Norton, the son of Alpha Gregory Norton, and looking at Bradley Norton was something the pack had learned not to do. Bradley had a way of making people feel small for noticing things. A raised eyebrow, a slow, amused smile, a reminder, never spoken outright but always understood, that his father controlled who kept their position and who did not. So the pack repeated the story about the training accident, and they meant it kindly, the way people mean things when they have decided that kindness and truth cannot both survive in the same room. Felicia had stopped correcting them weeks ago. The first few times someone offered their sympathy for her clumsy fall, she had opened her mouth to say something closer to the truth, only to watch their faces shift, polite concern sliding quickly into discomfort, as though her honesty were the inconvenience, rather than what had actually happened to her. She had learned, the way people learn anything that keeps them safe, that nodding along cost her less than speaking up. It cost her something different instead, something quieter and slower, the kind of cost that did not show up all at once, but settled into her over weeks. in the space behind her ribs, where hope used to live. She thought sometimes of Bradley Norton walking freely through the same halls she did, greeted with respect, his father's name opening every door before he even reached for it. And she wondered how a single person could cause so much harm and still be the one who slept easily at night. By midday, the hall had filled with warriors and elders gathering for the visiting delegation. Word had spread that an Alpha King was arriving for diplomatic talks, someone from a territory far enough away that most of Silver Hollow had only heard his name in passing. Alpha King Leonard Whitaker. Felicia kept her eyes on her work as the room filled around her, grateful that attention had shifted away from her for once. She did not look up when the doors opened, and the temperature in the room seemed to change, the way it does when someone enters who carries real weight. But she felt it, a stillness moving through the hall. The sound of chairs scraping back as the council rose, the rustle of fabric as heads bowed. She looked up out of habit, the same instinct that made every wolf in the room turn toward authority, and found herself looking directly at Leonard Whitaker. He was tall, with the kind of quiet stillness that came from a man who did not need to raise his voice to be heard. His eyes moved across the hall, taking in the bowed heads, the polished floor, the careful arrangement of a pack, putting its best face forward for a guest. There was nothing dramatic in the way he entered, no announcement beyond the formal titles exchanged at the door, and yet the entire hall seemed to reorganize itself around his presence, the way a room does around someone whose attention cannot easily be redirected. Felicia had seen visiting dignitaries before, men who wore their authority like an expensive cloak, more concerned with being noticed than with noticing anything themselves. Leonard Whitaker did not carry himself that way. His gaze moved like a man reading a room for information, not for admiration. And then his eyes found her. Felicia felt her spine straighten on instinct, the way it always did under attention. But Leonard's gaze did not move on the way most people's did. It stayed. It studied the way her hand still rested on the counter for support. It noticed the paleness beneath her careful smile. It noticed, she realized with a small jolt of fear, the way every single person near her had gone very deliberately quiet. Alpha Gregory Norton stepped forward with his easy, practiced smile, already extending a hand toward their guest. Alpha King Whitaker, welcome to Silver Hollow. We are honored. Leonard turned toward Gregory and offered the expected courtesies, his voice warm enough, his manners polished enough. But Felicia, watching from behind the counter, saw something flicker behind his eyes that had not been there a moment before. He had looked at her, and he had looked at the room's careful silence around her, and some quiet part of him had already begun asking a question nobody in Silver Hollow had been brave enough to ask aloud. Why does no one look at the girl who cannot sit down? The rest of the formal welcome passed in the usual blur of titles and courtesies, the kind of ceremony Felicia had watched unfold a dozen times before, for various visiting dignitaries. She kept her attention on her work, grateful that the room's focus had shifted fully onto the Alpha King and away from her. Yet she could not quite shake the strange, unsettled feeling that had moved through her the moment his eyes found hers. Nobody had looked at her quite like that in 3 weeks. Not with pity, and not with the careful avoidance she had grown used to, but with something closer to recognition, as though he had seen, in a single glance, exactly what the rest of the pack had spent 3 weeks refusing to see. The formal talks lasted through the afternoon. Leonard sat across from Gregory Norton in the council chamber, discussing border markers and trade routes for the coming season, and he gave the conversation every appearance of his full attention. But underneath the easy nods and measured responses, his mind kept circling back to the records hall. Bradley Norton sat near his father through most of the meeting, contributing little, watching the room with the relaxed confidence of someone who had never once worried about consequences. Leonard noticed that too. He noticed the way the older warriors in the room seemed to angle themselves slightly away from Bradley, the way conversation grew careful whenever his name came up in passing. At one point, an elder mentioned, in the middle of discussing supply routes, that the records hall had been short-staffed lately because their keeper had been recovering from an accident. An accident, Leonard repeated, keeping his tone light. A fall, Gregory said smoothly, already moving the conversation forward, near the old patrol grounds. Nothing serious, thankfully. Leonard noted that nobody in the room looked at Gregory when he said it. They looked at their hands, at the table, at the maps spread before them. Nobody looked at Gregory the way people look at someone telling a true story. He noticed, too, that healer Rebecca Daniels, who had been called in briefly to discuss the pack's medical readiness for winter, went very quiet the moment the word accident was spoken, and did not speak again until the subject had safely passed. Leonard had led his own pack long enough to know the difference between a quiet room and an honest one. An honest room had texture to its silence, the natural pauses of people thinking before they answered. This room had something else entirely, a careful, rehearsed stillness, as though everyone present had agreed beforehand on exactly how much truth the air could hold. He found himself watching the small things instead of the large ones. The way Gregory's hand rested a little too casually on the table whenever the conversation drifted near his son's name. The way the younger council members glanced toward the elders before answering even simple questions, as if checking for permission to speak honestly. It was a pack performing comfort it did not feel, and Leonard had spent enough years at council tables to recognize a performance when he saw one. When the formal talks ended for the day, Leonard found an excuse that felt thin even as he made it. He needed to review old boundary maps, he said, and the records hall would have them. He walked in just as the afternoon light was beginning to fade, turning the hall a soft amber color. Felicia was still there, alone now, carefully filing away the last of the day's paperwork. She startled slightly when she saw him, then caught herself and offered a small, polite bow. "Alpha King Whitaker, how can I help you?" "I'm told you keep the old boundary records here," Leonard said, which was true enough, though it was not really why he had come. She led him to a shelf near the back of the hall, moving with that same careful precision he had noticed that morning, every step measured, every reach calculated, to avoid some pain she was clearly trying to hide. He watched her retrieve a heavy folded map and set it on the counter, and he watched her hand brace against the wood the entire time, as though standing required more effort than it should. She felt his attention on her, the entire walk back to the counter, not the heavy, watchful attention she had grown used to from a pack, waiting for her to falter, but something quieter, something that did not seem to be searching for weakness at all. It unsettled her in a way she could not quite name. She had spent 3 weeks learning exactly how much of herself to show people, calibrating her smile and her posture, until even she sometimes forgot what she actually felt beneath the performance. Leonard's gaze did not seem interested in the performance. It seemed interested in her, and she did not yet know what to do with that. "You don't sit," he said quietly. Not an accusation, just an observation, offered gently, the way you might mention the weather. Felicia's hand stilled on the counter. "I prefer to stand. It helps me concentrate." "For 3 weeks?" She looked up at him then, and for a moment, something raw passed behind her eyes before she pulled it back into the polite, practiced calm she wore for everyone. It would have been easier, she thought, if he had simply accepted her excuse the way everyone else had. Instead, his question sat between them, patient and unhurried, waiting for an honesty she was not yet ready to give. "I should let you look at the maps, Alpha King," she said finally. Leonard did not push her. He had learned, over years of leading his own pack, that the people most in need of being believed were often the ones most certain that no one would. Pushing only confirmed what they already feared. So instead, he simply nodded, unrolled the map, and asked her thoughtful questions about the old boundary lines, treating her not as a wounded thing to be handled carefully, but as a person whose knowledge mattered. It was such a small thing, but Felicia could not remember the last time someone had spoken to her, as though her answers were worth listening to, rather than waiting for her to finish, so they could change the subject. She found herself studying him in small, careful glances, while he read over the old boundary lines, noting the way he listened with his whole attention, rather than the half-attention most visitors offered a records keeper. He asked about the families named on the old agreements, not because the politics mattered to him in that moment, but because, he said, history was easier to understand once you knew the people inside it. It was an unfamiliar kind of company, gentle without being careful, attentive without being intrusive, and by the time he rolled the map closed, Felicia realized she had stood through their entire conversation without once thinking about the pain in her back. When he left that evening, Leonard found his most trusted warrior, Colin Hawkins, and asked him to quietly look into the old patrol grounds. Not as an accusation, just a question that needed an honest answer. Colin returned within the hour, his face troubled. "The patrol grounds haven't been used for formal training in over a year, my lord. Too uneven, too far from the main paths. Nobody trains out there anymore. And yet, that's where she was hurt," Leonard said. "That's the story," Colin agreed. "But I asked around, careful as I could. A few of the younger guards mentioned, almost in passing, that Bradley Norton was seen heading that direction the same night Felicia was injured. Nobody wanted to say much more than that." Leonard sat with that information for a long moment, watching the fire in his guest chamber burn low. He thought of Felicia's hand on the counter, her careful, measured steps, the way an entire pack had agreed, without ever discussing it, to look the other way. He had governed his own territory long enough to understand how silence like that took root. It rarely began with cruelty. It began with small compromises, a healer choosing her position over her conscience, a friend deciding it was safer not to ask, a mother convincing herself that staying quiet was the same as keeping her daughter safe. Each small compromise, alone, might have seemed forgivable. Together, they had built a wall around the truth, thick enough that a young woman could suffer in plain sight for over 3 weeks without a single person daring to break it down. That night, long after the hall had emptied and most of Silver Hollow had gone quiet for the evening, Leonard returned to the records hall and found Felicia still there, sorting through papers by lamplight because, he suspected, going back to her room meant going back to silence and pain, with nothing to distract her from either. "You should rest," he said gently. "I will, soon." He did not leave. He pulled a chair close to the counter, not for himself to sit in, but simply so the space between them felt less formal, less like an alpha addressing a subject, and more like two people talking. "I don't believe the story about the training accident," Leonard said quietly. "I think someone hurt you, and I think you've been too afraid to say so." Felicia's hands stilled completely. The lamp flickered between them. For a long moment, she said nothing at all, and Leonard let the silence stretch, refusing to fill it with pressure she did not ask for. The silence between them did not feel empty the way most silences had felt to her these past weeks. It felt almost gentle, the kind of quiet that gave her room to breathe instead of room to disappear. She studied his face in the lamplight, searching for the impatience she had braced herself to find, the subtle signal that her time to answer was running out. She found none of it. He simply waited, steady as the flame between them, as though he had nowhere else in the world he needed to be. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "It was not an accident." It was the first time in 23 days that anyone in Silver Hollow had heard her say it plainly, and Leonard, looking at her trembling hands and her too pale face, believed her without a single moment of doubt. "Then tell me what happened," he said. "Only when you're ready. I'm not going anywhere." The next morning, Leonard sent word to his personal healer, Amber Whitaker, a distant cousin he trusted more than almost anyone in his pack. He asked her to come to Silver Hollow quietly, under the simple explanation that she would be assisting with seasonal medical preparations during his stay. Amber arrived by midday, and Leonard arranged for her to examine Felicia in private, away from Rebecca Daniels and away from curious eyes. Amber had a gift for making people feel safe. She spoke softly, explained every step before she took it, and never once made Felicia feel like a problem to be solved rather than a person deserving care. She had trained as a healer under one of the most respected practitioners in Leonard's territory, and over the years had developed a quiet reputation for treating frightened patients with unusual patience. The kind of patience that came from understanding that fear itself could be its own injury, separate from whatever physical harm had brought someone to her in the first place. She moved slowly around Felicia that first afternoon, narrating each small action in a calm, even voice, giving Felicia room to say stop at any moment, though Felicia never did. "You've been in pain for over 3 weeks," Amber said, gently checking the old injury. "And from what I can see here, this was never treated properly. The wound should have closed faster than this. Whatever medicine you were given wasn't strong enough to do its job." "Rebecca said it would heal in time," Felicia said quietly. Amber's jaw tightened, though she kept her voice even. "It should have healed already, if it had been treated the way an injury like this needs to be treated." She paused, then added, carefully, "This wasn't caused by a fall, Felicia. A fall doesn't leave marks like this." Felicia stared at a small water stain on the ceiling above the cot, focusing on its uneven edges, because it was easier than meeting Amber's eyes. She had spent 3 weeks building a careful wall around the truth, brick by brick, smiling at the right moments, deflecting the right questions. And now, in this quiet room, the wall was coming down faster than she could brace for it. Strange, she thought, how relief and fear could feel almost identical in the chest, both of them tight and breathless, both of them impossible to ignore. Felicia closed her eyes. She had known it, of course. She had lived with the truth every single day for over 3 weeks. But hearing someone else say it, someone with real medical knowledge, made it impossible to keep pretending the lie might somehow be true. It was while Amber was carefully checking the torn fabric of Felicia's cloak, the one she had been wearing the night of the incident, and had never been able to bring herself to throw away, that she found it. A small silver clasp, caught in the lining where it had slipped during a struggle and gone unnoticed. Amber held it up to the light. The metal bore a crest, simple but unmistakable. The Norton Patrol crest, the same one worn by every guard under Bradley Norton's command. "This isn't yours," Amber said quietly. Felicia stared at the small piece of silver, and something in her chest, something that had been holding very still for 23 days, finally cracked open. "No, it isn't." She told them everything then, in a voice that shook but did not stop. Bradley Norton had been pursuing her for months, finding reasons to linger near the records hall, offering compliments she had never asked for, and attention she had never wanted. She had refused him politely, again and again, hoping he would simply lose interest. Instead, at the harvest gathering 3 weeks ago, she had refused him in front of others, after he had pushed too hard and too publicly, leaving her no graceful way to decline quietly. He had smiled at the time, the same cold smile she remembered from after, and said nothing more. She remembered the gathering clearly, the lanterns strung between the trees, the sound of fiddles and laughter carrying across the field, the warmth of a night that had felt, for a few hours, like an ordinary celebration. Bradley had found her near the cider table, his voice pitched just loud enough for those nearby to hear, asking if she would walk with him later, framing the question in a way that made refusal sound like rudeness. She had said no as gently as she knew how, hoping to spare them both an audience. Instead, his expression had flickered, quick and cold, before the easy smile slid back into place, and she remembered thinking, with a small chill she could not explain, that she had made a mistake refusing him in front of so many witnesses. The next evening, she had taken a shortcut home past the old patrol grounds, a route she had walked 100 times without trouble. He had been waiting. She did not give every detail. She did not need to. The pain in her voice, the way her hands shook around the silver clasp, told Leonard and Amber more than words alone ever could. Leonard sat very still through the telling, his jaw set, his hands clenched against his knees. Anger moved through him like a current, hot and immediate. But he kept his voice low and steady, because he understood that Felicia needed calm more than she needed his fury, however justified it might be. It took everything in him to stay seated, to keep his hands open instead of curled into fists, to let his face remain something gentle for her to look at, instead of the storm building underneath it. He had led warriors into difficult disputes before, had faced down threats to his own territory without his pulse quickening, and yet nothing in his years of leadership had prepared him for the particular kind of restraint required to sit across from a frightened young woman and let her see only steadiness, when everything in him wanted to ride straight to Bradley Norton's door before the sun rose. He reminded himself, silently, that justice done carelessly in anger rarely held up to scrutiny, and that Felicia needed a patient ally far more than she needed a furious one. So he breathed and listened and let his anger settle into something colder and more useful, the kind of resolve that would carry them all the way to the Grand Alpha Council without faltering. The next morning, Felicia continued, I went to Rebecca. I told her the truth, and she looked at me, and she wrote down that I had fallen during a training drill, and she told me it would be easier for everyone if I let people believe it. Easier for everyone except you, Leonard said quietly. Felicia nodded, and for the first time since he had met her, she let herself cry. Not the careful, contained tears of someone performing composure, but the real, exhausted release of someone who had been holding herself together for far too long. He simply stayed, steady and present, until she was ready to breathe again. That evening, Leonard and Amber confronted Rebecca Daniels privately, away from the rest of the council. At first, Rebecca tried to hold to her story, repeating the words, training accident, with the same flat certainty she had used in the ledger. But when Amber laid out the medical evidence, plainly and without cruelty, Rebecca's composure finally broke. Alpha Norton came to me himself, she admitted, her voice shaking. He said if word got out about what his son had done, it would damage the pack's standing before the council. He said I would lose my position if I did not write the report as an accident. I have a daughter to provide for, Alpha King. I was afraid. Your fear protected Bradley Norton and punished Felicia Crawford. Leonard said, not unkindly, but without softening the truth either. I understand why you were afraid, but I need you to understand what your silence cost her. He kept his voice level as he spoke, though it cost him something to do so. He had no wish to crush a frightened woman further than circumstance already had. Yet he also understood that gentleness offered without honesty would only teach Rebecca, and anyone who heard of this conversation afterward, that fear remained an acceptable excuse for harm. There was a difference, he believed, between compassion and excuse-making, and he intended to hold that line carefully, for Felicia's sake as much as for Rebecca's own eventual redemption. Rebecca lowered her head, and for a long moment she said nothing at all. When she finally looked up, her eyes were wet. What do you need me to do? Tell the truth, Leonard said. When the time comes. Rebecca nodded slowly, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. I have wanted to. Every single day since I wrote that report. I told myself it was a small lie, a kindness that spared the pack trouble. But I have watched her stand behind that counter for 3 weeks, refusing to sit, and I have known every single day that my small lie was the reason she had to carry it alone. Her voice cracked. I am ashamed, Alpha King. I should have chosen differently. Then choose differently now, Leonard said. It is not too late to be honest, even if it is later than it should have been. Later that night, alone in his guest chamber, Leonard turned the small silver clasp over in his hand and understood, with growing certainty, that this was no longer a private matter between two young people. This was a pack leadership that had chosen to protect cruelty rather than confront it. And that kind of protection rarely stopped at just one victim. He set the clasp down on the table beside his bed, but sleep did not come easily. He kept seeing Felicia's face in the records hall that first morning. The careful smile stretched over real pain, and he kept thinking of how many other faces in Silver Hollow likely wore the same kind of smile, for reasons nobody had yet uncovered. A pack that hid one truth this carefully had almost certainly practiced hiding others. The thought settled over him heavy and certain, and by the time the candle finally burned low, he had already decided that whatever came next, he would not be leaving Silver Hollow until every hidden truth had found its way into the light. Leonard asked Colin Hawkins to widen his quiet inquiries, this time looking not just at the night of Felicia's injury, but at the pattern surrounding it. Colin spent the following days speaking carefully with lower-ranking warriors, kitchen staff, and old patrol guards who had little reason to protect the Norton family, and every reason to remember things others had chosen to forget. What he found troubled him more with each new conversation. Dominic Holden had once been a respected warrior in Silver Hollow's patrol, until he refused, 2 years earlier, to help cover for Bradley after an incident with another young woman in the pack. Within a month, Dominic had been quietly removed from patrol duty and reassigned to border watch at the furthest edge of Silver Hollow's territory, a position with little standing and even less opportunity for advancement. When Colin found him there, Dominic had not seemed surprised that someone had finally come asking. He spoke plainly, without bitterness, though something tired moved behind his eyes as he described the night he had been asked to alter a patrol log to account for Bradley's whereabouts, and the quiet, almost gentle way his reassignment had followed soon after, with no explanation offered and none expected. "Nobody ever told me I was being punished," he said. "They just made sure I understood it anyway." Chelsea Benson, once Rebecca Daniels's healer assistant, had questioned a string of injury reports that did not match the explanations given for them. Third, she had been transferred to a distant outpost within weeks, officially for training purposes, though everyone who remembered her departure understood it had nothing to do with training at all. And Brooke Pearson, a maid who worked in the Alpha House, told Colin, in a hushed voice, that she had once overheard Gregory Norton speaking sharply to his son behind closed doors. She had only caught a fragment of the conversation, but it had stayed with her. "Be more careful next time. People are starting to notice." Brooke had carried that single sentence for 2 years, turning it over in her mind during quiet moments, never quite certain what to do with a piece of knowledge that felt too large for her position and too dangerous to repeat. She told Colin she had almost convinced herself she had misheard it, or misunderstood its meaning, because believing otherwise meant accepting that the Alpha she served had known about his son's cruelty all along, and chosen, deliberately, to manage it rather than stop it. Saying the words out loud to Colin, finally, felt like setting down something she had not realized she was still carrying. When Colin reported all of this to Leonard, the weight of it settled over the room like a held breath. Felicia was not the first. She was simply the most recent name in a pattern that Silver Hollow's leadership had worked hard, and successfully, to keep buried. Leonard thought of how easily a pack could convince itself that silence was the same thing as peace. Dominic Holden had lost a position he loved because he refused to lie. Chelsea Benson had been sent away simply for asking questions a good healer's assistant should have asked. Brooke Pearson had spent 2 years carrying a single overheard sentence, too afraid to repeat it to anyone who might actually do something with it. Each of them had learned the same lesson Felicia had learned, that speaking up in Silver Hollow cost more than staying quiet, and that lesson had been taught so thoroughly, so consistently, that an entire pack had organized itself around protecting one family's reputation instead of its own people. "How many more are there?" Leonard asked quietly, "that we haven't found yet?" "I don't know," Colin admitted, "but I think the only reason any of this came out at all is because you were the one asking." Meanwhile, under Amber's steady care, Felicia had slowly begun to heal. She managed short periods of sitting, then longer ones, each small victory met with quiet relief rather than celebration, because both of them understood that healing the body was only part of what she needed. Leonard made a habit of visiting her in the small garden behind the records hall in the early evenings, where the noise of the pack faded into birdsong and the rustle of leaves. Their conversations rarely touched on the investigation directly. Instead, they talked about the old records she had spent years organizing, the histories of families long since past, the books she had read as a girl, and the life she had once imagined for herself, before fear had made her world small and careful. "I wanted to travel," Felicia admitted one evening, watching the last light fade behind the trees. "I used to think I'd see other territories someday, see how other packs lived." "You still can," Leonard said. She gave him a small, doubtful smile. "It feels like a different life now, like something that belonged to someone braver than me. You whispered the truth for 23 days, even when nobody wanted to hear it, Leonard said quietly. That's not the absence of courage, Felicia. That is courage, even when it doesn't feel like it. She turned his words over in her mind, long after he had gone that evening, lying awake in the quiet dark of her room, surprised by how much she wanted to believe him. For 3 weeks, she had measured her worth by how well she managed to disappear, how convincingly she could perform wellness for an audience that did not want the truth. Nobody had ever suggested that the whispering itself, the simple, exhausting act of repeating a truth nobody wanted to hear, might count as something closer to bravery than weakness. She fell asleep that night, turning the idea over like a small, unfamiliar gift, uncertain yet whether she was ready to accept it, but no longer entirely willing to refuse it either. Something warm passed between them in that moment, quiet and unhurried, the first soft thread of something neither of them had expected to find in the middle of so much pain. Leonard found himself looking forward to these evenings more than he wanted to admit, drawn not to the duty of protecting a witness, but to the quiet strength of the woman herself, the dry humor that occasionally slipped through her careful composure, the way her face changed when she spoke about the books she loved. Felicia, for her part, found herself trusting him in a way she had not trusted anyone in a very long time. He never rushed her. He never demanded more than she offered. He simply stayed, steady and patient, and let her find her own way back toward herself. There was a particular evening, a few days into their quiet routine, when a sudden rain sent them both hurrying beneath the overhang near the garden gate, laughing despite themselves at how quickly the sky had turned. Standing close together, watching the rain fall in silver sheets over the records hall roof, Felicia caught herself thinking that she had not laughed, truly laughed, in longer than she could remember, and that the sound of her own laughter, however small, felt like proof that something in her was still alive beneath all the careful holding together. Leonard glanced at her sideways, something soft moving across his face, and neither of them said anything about it, though both of them carried the moment with them long after the rain passed. But Bradley Norton had begun to notice the Alpha King's frequent visits to the records hall, and his easy confidence had started to show small cracks of unease. He cornered Felicia in a quiet corridor one afternoon, his familiar smile firmly back in place, though something colder moved behind it now. She felt the old fear rise the moment she recognized his footsteps behind her, a reflex her body had not yet unlearned. For 3 weeks, the sound of his voice alone had been enough to make her chest tighten, and even now, with Leonard's protection wrapped loosely around her days, that old instinct had not entirely faded. She straightened her spine anyway, refusing to let him see how close the fear still sat beneath her skin. "You've been spending a lot of time with our guest," he said lightly. "I'd be careful, if I were you. Alpha Kings don't stay forever, and when he leaves, you'll still be here, in Silver Hollow, with the rest of us." Felicia's heart pounded, old fear rising fast and familiar, but before she could find words, Leonard's voice came calm and even from the end of the corridor. "Is there a problem here?" Bradley's smile did not waver, but he stepped back, putting careful distance between himself and Felicia. "No problem at all, Alpha King, just a friendly conversation." Leonard walked closer, his presence filling the corridor in a way that had nothing to do with size, and everything to do with quiet, unmistakable authority. "Then you won't mind if I remind you of something, Bradley. The days of hiding behind your father's name are coming to an end. I would think very carefully about what you do next." Bradley's jaw tightened, the first real flicker of fear Felicia had ever seen cross his face. He said nothing more, simply turned and walked away, but the silence he left behind felt different now. Less like the comfortable silence of someone certain of his own safety, and more like the brittle quiet of someone who understood, for the first time, that the ground beneath him was beginning to shift. Felicia stood in the corridor long after he had gone, her heart still pounding, though for once the fear was tangled with something close to triumph. She had not spoken a single word during the exchange, and yet she had not crumbled either. She had simply stood her ground, and Leonard had stood beside her, and Bradley Norton, for the first time in 3 weeks, had been the one to walk away first. Word moved quickly through Silver Hollow, the way it always did, and within days Bradley understood that Leonard was building something far more serious than idle suspicion. He went to his father in private, his composure cracking at the edges, and demanded that something be done before the Alpha King's visit became a full reckoning. Gregory tried diplomacy first. He approached Leonard with smooth, practiced concern, suggesting that whatever had happened to the records keeper was a private pack matter, not something requiring outside involvement. Leonard listened politely, and then, just as politely, refused to look away. A young woman in your pack was harmed, and your leadership chose to bury the truth rather than protect her, Leonard said evenly. That is no longer a private matter, Alpha Norton. That is a question for the Grand Alpha Council. Gregory's composure did not fully break, but something in his eyes turned sharp and calculating, and Leonard understood that whatever happened next would not happen gently. He had seen men like Gregory before, leaders who mistook charm for integrity and confused control with respect. Such men rarely surrendered power willingly, not because they believed themselves right, but because they had spent so long being treated as right that the difference had stopped mattering to them. Leonard watched Gregory walk away that afternoon, and felt, with a certainty that settled cold and clear in his chest, that the coming days would test exactly how far a desperate man might go to protect what he had built on someone else's silence. Colin's quiet inquiries soon turned up something far more dangerous than careful silence. Bradley had reached out to 2 guards from outside Silver Hollow's usual ranks, men named Felix Daniels and Ivan Pearson, known less for loyalty and more for being willing to do whatever they were paid to do. Colin had tracked their movements through a series of small, careless mistakes. A coin purse spent too freely at a roadside tavern, a hushed conversation overheard by a stable hand who had no reason to keep it secret. Neither man had bothered to hide their tracks particularly well, which told Leonard something useful in itself. Bradley was not thinking clearly anymore. Desperation had begun to outpace his usual careful arrogance, and desperate men, Leonard knew from long experience, were often the most dangerous, precisely because they had stopped weighing consequences. If Felicia is meant to testify before the council, Colin said grimly, Bradley may try to make sure that never happens. Leonard felt the weight of that settle hard in his chest. He found Felicia that evening in the garden, and though he tried to soften the news, there was no gentle way to tell her that she was no longer safe within the walls she had called home her entire life. I want you to come with me to Blackstone Keep, he said. You'll be protected there. You can heal and prepare to speak before the council, without fear of what might happen to you here. He watched her face carefully as he spoke, ready to soften the request if it frightened her, ready to give her room to refuse if refusing was what she needed. He had learned by now that the worst thing he could do was make this decision feel inevitable, even though, in his own heart, the danger felt urgent enough that waiting did not feel like an option at all. Felicia's eyes filled with a complicated mix of relief and grief. Part of her wanted nothing more than to be somewhere safe, somewhere the whispers and averted eyes could not follow her. But another part of her, the part that still remembered Silver Hollow as home, despite everything it had failed to be for her, hesitated. She thought of the records hall, of the tall stool she used to sit on as a girl, while Hester taught her how to read old maps, of the river path she had walked 1,000 times before it became the place where everything changed. Leaving did not feel like simple relief. It felt like grieving a home that had already, in its own quiet way, stopped being safe long before she admitted it to herself. My mother is still here, she said quietly. I know, Leonard said. And if she wants to come with you, she's welcome to. But Felicia, I cannot guarantee your safety here, not with Bradley growing more desperate by the day. That night, Felicia packed only what mattered most. Her mother's old shawl, faded with years, but still soft with familiar warmth. Her records journal, filled with her own careful handwriting, documenting years of pack history. And the small silver clasp, wrapped carefully in cloth, the one piece of evidence that had finally given her story a shape the world could not deny. Courtney Crawford found her daughter in the small hours before dawn, bag already over her shoulder, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "Please," Courtney finally whispered, "please, don't do this. If you speak before the council, if you say his name out loud in front of everyone, there's no taking it back. Gregory will never forgive this pack. We'll lose everything." "You knew," Felicia said quietly. It was not a question. Courtney's face crumpled, years of carefully held silence finally giving way. "I suspected. I was afraid, Felicia. Afraid of what speaking up would cost us. I told myself, silence was protecting you." "It wasn't," Felicia said, and her voice, though gentle, did not waver. "I needed you to look at me, Mama. I needed someone to see what was happening and say it out loud. Instead, I stood behind that counter for 23 days, and the only person who finally saw me was a stranger." Courtney reached for her daughter's hand, tears falling freely now. "I'm sorry. I am so sorry." Felicia let her mother hold her hand for a long moment. Grief and love tangled together in a way that could not be untangled quickly. She thought of all the years before this one, the warmth of her mother's hands braiding her hair before festivals, the soft lullabies hummed over a sickbed during childhood fevers, the thousand small kindnesses that had built the foundation of who she was. None of that disappeared simply because her mother had failed her in this one terrible way. But it did not erase the failure either, and Felicia understood, standing in the doorway with her bag already over her shoulder, that some kinds of love and some kinds of disappointment could exist in the same heart at the same time, without canceling each other out. "I'm not leaving because I don't love you," she said softly. "I'm leaving because I finally have to choose myself." She left before the sun fully rose, walking beside Leonard through the quiet, sleeping paths of Silver Hollow, her mother's shawl wrapped close around her shoulders. By the time the pack woke to the ordinary business of mourning, Felicia Crawford was already gone, and Bradley Norton, hearing the news with a cold drop in his stomach, understood that the one person who could undo everything was now beyond his reach, safely held under the protection of an Alpha King. The road away from Silver Hollow wound through familiar hills, past the river she had crossed 100 times, past the old oak tree where she and Paige used to share secrets as children. Felicia did not look back, though every part of her wanted to. She kept her eyes forward, on the road ahead, on the small, fragile hope that somewhere beyond these hills, a different kind of life might finally be waiting for her. One where she would not have to whisper the truth, and wait for someone to finally believe it. Leonard rode beside her in comfortable silence, sensing that words would only crowd a moment that needed space to simply exist. The morning mist still clung to the lower fields, and somewhere behind them, Silver Hollow was waking to discover she was gone, though neither of them spoke of it. There would be time enough, in the days ahead, for explanations and consequences, and the long, difficult work of justice. For now, there was only the road, and the quiet relief of finally moving toward something, instead of simply enduring what had already happened to her. Blackstone Keep felt like nothing Felicia had known before. The halls were warm, filled with easy laughter, and the comfortable noise of a pack that had nothing to hide. Nobody whispered when she walked past. Nobody lowered their eyes or changed the subject when she mentioned her injury, now slowly healing under Amber's continued care. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Felicia felt something close to safe. She spent her first mornings simply walking the halls, learning the rhythm of a place built on a different kind of trust than the one she had grown up with. Children ran past her without fear in their eyes. Warriors greeted her with simple nods rather than careful, measuring glances, and the kitchen staff teased each other openly, without the tight, guarded humor she had grown used to in Silver Hollow. It took her several days to understand why the difference unsettled her at first. It was not that Blackstone Keep was perfect. It was that nobody here had ever taught her to expect silence as the price of belonging. Amber continued her care each morning, and slowly, the sharp, constant pain that had defined Felicia's days for over 3 weeks began to soften into something more manageable, an ache that came and went, rather than one that never left at all. The first time she managed to sit through an entire meal without needing to rise and pace the discomfort away. She said nothing about it to anyone, but she carried the small victory with her for the rest of the day, turning it over in her mind the way one might turn over a smooth stone found on a riverbank, simple and quietly precious. Her bond with Leonard deepened with each passing day, no longer shaped by investigation or protection alone, but by something gentler, something that had been quietly growing between them since that first evening in the records hall. One night, Leonard found her on the balcony outside her chamber, looking out over the moonlit hills of his territory. He joined her there, close but unhurried, and for a long while, neither of them spoke at all. The night air smelled of cedar and distant rain, and somewhere below the keep, an owl called once and went quiet. Felicia let herself simply breathe for a while, aware of Leonard's presence beside her, without the old instinct to brace herself against it. It was a strange, gentle thing, learning that closeness did not have to mean danger, that a person could stand near her without expecting anything from her at all. "I've tried to keep my feelings separate from this," he finally admitted, his voice low. "I told myself I was simply protecting a witness, doing what was right because it was right. But I can't keep pretending that's all this is to me anymore, Felicia." Her heart beat faster, though not from fear this time. "What is it then?" "You," he said simply. "It's you. I care for you, more deeply than I expected to, and more deeply than seems wise, given everything still ahead of us. But I won't pretend otherwise any longer." Felicia felt the words settle over her slowly, warm and a little frightening all at once. She had spent so long bracing for the next disappointment, the next person who would let her down, that the simple steadiness of his honesty almost felt like something she needed to brace against too, out of habit more than reason. "I'm afraid," she admitted quietly, "afraid that whatever happiness I find will be taken from me, the way everything else has been taken these past weeks." "I will never use my position to take your choice from you," Leonard said, his voice steady and sure. "Whatever happens between us, it has to be something you choose freely, not something given to you because you feel you owe it to me. I want your trust, Felicia, not your gratitude." She felt something inside her, something that had been clenched tight for 23 days and longer, finally begin to loosen. She reached for his hand, and he held it gently. And when she leaned into him, it was not the posture of someone being rescued. It was the quiet, deliberate choice of someone finally allowing herself to trust again. The peace did not last long. Within the week, Blackstone Keep's outer guards caught 2 men attempting to slip past the perimeter under cover of darkness. Under questioning, the men, Felix Daniels and Ivan Pearson, confessed quickly and without much resistance, eager to avoid further trouble. The Keep's guards had spotted them well before they reached the inner walls. Blackstone Keep's patrols, far more vigilant than the men had apparently expected, accustomed as they likely were to the looser watch kept around Silver Hollow's borders. By the time Leonard arrived to oversee their questioning himself, both men had already abandoned any pretense of innocence, more interested in minimizing their own punishment than protecting whoever had hired them. Bradley Norton had hired them to frighten Felicia into silence, or failing that, to destroy any evidence she carried that might support her testimony. They also confirmed, in halting but clear terms, that Gregory Norton had known of his son's plan and had done nothing to stop it. Leonard listened to their confessions with quiet, controlled fury. This was the final piece, the proof that placed responsibility not only on Bradley's cruelty, but on his father's deliberate choice to shield it. He thought of every excuse Gregory had offered across their formal talks, every smooth deflection, every careful redirection away from his son's name, and understood now that none of it had been the simple discomfort of a father protecting a child from embarrassment. It had been calculation, cold and deliberate, the kind of protection that required knowing exactly what needed protecting from. A father who merely suspected wrongdoing might stay silent out of fear or denial. A father who arranged hired men to silence a witness understood, with total clarity, exactly what his son had done. He sat with Amber and Colin late into that night, reviewing every piece of evidence they had gathered since his first uneasy glance across the records hall weeks earlier, making certain nothing would be left unaccounted for when the council finally convened. There would be no room, he decided, for Gregory to find a single thread of doubt to pull at. The truth would have to stand whole, undeniable, and complete. That same night, Leonard sent a formal message across the territories, calling for the Grand Alpha Council to convene. Silver Hollow Pack, the message read, would answer for what had been allowed to happen within its walls. The Grand Alpha Council gathered in a vast stone hall, built for moments exactly like this one. Alphas, Lunas, healers, and witnesses from territories near and far filled the seats, drawn by word that Silver Hollow's leadership stood accused of covering up serious harm done to one of its own. Felicia stood beside Leonard near the front of the hall, her hands trembling slightly, though she no longer hid it the way she once had. Amber stood close on her other side, a steady, reassuring presence. Felicia wore her mother's old shawl over her shoulders, a small piece of home carried into a room that felt impossibly large. She had imagined this moment 100 times in the weeks since leaving Silver Hollow, rehearsing words in the quiet of her chamber at Blackstone Keep, trying to find a way to say everything without breaking apart in front of strangers. Now that the moment had finally arrived, every rehearsed word seemed to scatter, leaving only the plain, unpolished truth she had carried for so long. She found, strangely, that the plain truth felt stronger than anything she could have prepared. Gregory Norton arrived with Bradley at his side, both dressed in their finest, both wearing carefully composed expressions of confidence that did not quite reach their eyes. Gregory spoke first, his voice smooth and practiced, suggesting that Leonard had overstepped his authority by interfering in what remained, at its heart, an internal pack matter. Bradley said little, but the small, certain smile he wore suggested he still believed Felicia would falter. That fear would win out over truth, the way it always had before. He was wrong. Leonard presented the evidence first, methodically and without exaggeration. Amber's medical findings, clearly showing the injury had not come from any simple fall. Rebecca Daniels's own admission, given in trembling but honest words, that she had falsified the original report under direct pressure from Gregory. The small silver clasp bearing the Norton Patrol crest, found tangled in Felicia's torn cloak. The testimonies of Dominic Holden and Chelsea Benson, finally speaking openly about being silenced years earlier for daring to question the pattern. Brooke Pearson's account of the conversation she had overheard in the Alpha House. And finally, the confessions of Felix Daniels and Ivan Pearson, confirming that Bradley had hired them and that Gregory had known. A heavy silence settled over the hall as each piece was laid before the council, the weight of it building until even Gregory's composure began to visibly strain. One by one, the witnesses spoke. Dominic Holden described the night he had refused to alter a patrol log to protect Bradley, and the quiet reassignment that followed within weeks. Chelsea Benson described the questions she had asked about injury reports that never quite matched their explanations, and the distant outpost she had been sent to soon after. Brooke Pearson, her voice trembling but clear, repeated the warning she had overheard Gregory give his son 2 years earlier, a warning that suddenly made sense to everyone listening. Each testimony added another thread to a pattern the council could no longer dismiss as coincidence or misfortune. Then Felicia spoke. The hall seemed to hold its breath as she stepped forward, her mother's shawl still wrapped around her shoulders like armor. She had spent so many days rehearsing composure that her body fell into the old habit easily. Chin level, hands steady on the edge of the speaker's stand. The same careful stillness she had once used to hide her pain in the records hall. But this time, she let the stillness fall away. This time, she let them see what 23 days of silence had actually cost her. Her voice shook at first, soft and uncertain in the vast stone hall, but she did not stop. She told the council about 23 days of standing, because sitting brought unbearable pain. She told them about a friend who looked away, a healer who chose her own safety over the truth, and a mother who stayed silent out of fear. She told them about the cold smile she still saw sometimes when she closed her eyes, and the quiet, exhausting work of pretending to be fine when she was not. "I am not asking for revenge," she said, her voice growing steadier with each word. "I am asking for the truth to finally matter, more than comfort. I am asking that no other young wolf in any pack be told to carry their pain alone, because the person who caused it has power, and the people around them are too afraid to lose their place by speaking up." She paused, looking out over the gathered council, and for the first time in 23 days and longer, she did not feel small. "One person finally believed me," she said quietly. "It should never have taken that long. It should never take that long for anyone." The hall remained silent for a long moment after she finished. Then the council began to speak, weighing the evidence, the testimonies. The silver clasp passed from hand to hand among the elders. The deliberation took the better part of the afternoon, and Felicia stood through nearly all of it, her legs aching but her resolve unshaken, watching as council members from territories she had never visited debated the fate of a pack she had spent her whole life calling home. Gregory attempted, more than once, to interject with explanations that grew thinner each time he offered them, until even the council members most sympathetic to pack autonomy had stopped meeting his eyes. Bradley said almost nothing at all, his earlier confidence long since drained away, replaced by the stunned, hollow look of a man finally understanding that his father's name would not be enough to save him this time. The judgment, when it came, was swift and final. Gregory Norton was removed from his position as Alpha of Silver Hollow. His years of protecting cruelty over truth deemed an unforgivable failure of leadership. Bradley Norton was stripped of all rank and standing, exiled from any position of authority within Silver Hollow or any allied pack, a consequence that would follow him for the rest of his life. Rebecca Daniels lost her position as healer, though her honest confession earned her the chance to serve again someday, under careful supervision, should she choose to rebuild what trust she could. Silver Hollow itself was placed under temporary council protection, while new leadership was carefully chosen, with Dominic Holden and Chelsea Benson both invited to take part in shaping what came next. A murmur moved through the gathered council as the judgment was read, the particular sound of an entire room recognizing that something significant had shifted. Felicia stood very still through it all, watching the family that had caused her so much pain finally face consequences in front of witnesses from territories who would carry word of this judgment back to their own packs, a quiet but unmistakable signal that silence would no longer be the easiest answer. When the council finally adjourned, Felicia walked out of the stone hall into soft morning light, her legs unsteady, not from pain this time, but from the sheer release of finally setting down a weight she had carried alone for far too long. The air outside felt different somehow, lighter, as though the hall itself had exhaled along with her. She stood for a moment simply breathing, watching sunlight catch on the dew still clinging to the grass beyond the stone steps, and let herself feel, for the first time in longer than she could remember, something close to peace. Leonard found her there, just outside the doors, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all. "You're free now," he said finally. "Free to return to Silver Hollow, if that's what you want. With new leadership and the chance to rebuild. Free to stay at Blackstone Keep. Free to choose any path you want, Felicia. I meant what I said. Your choice, always." Felicia looked at him for a long moment, at the patient, steady man who had believed her before she had even fully found the words to explain why she needed believing. She thought of the records hall, of 23 days of silence, of a pack that had looked away, because looking away was easier than facing the truth. And she thought of moonlit balconies, and quiet evenings in a garden, and a hand that had never once asked her to be anything other than exactly who she was. She thought of the rain beneath the garden overhang, and the sound of her own laughter, surprising and welcome, returning to her bit by bit across the weeks since they had met. She thought of a stranger who had walked into a records hall expecting nothing more than formal talks about borders, and had instead given her back the parts of herself she had almost forgotten how to reach. "I choose you," she said softly. "Not because I need saving anymore, I don't, but because you saw me when no one else would, and I don't want to spend the rest of my life without that kind of seeing." Leonard smiled, the kind of smile that came from somewhere deep and certain, and reached for her hand. She took it without hesitation. Behind them, the bells of Silver Hollow began to ring, carried on the morning wind across the hills, no longer a sound of silence and avoided eyes, but the sound of a new beginning, for a pack finally choosing truth, and for two people who had found, in the middle of so much pain, something worth holding on to. In the months that followed, Felicia would return to Silver Hollow more than once, not as the girl who had been silenced, but as a woman whose voice had helped reshape her old home into something better than the one she left. Dominic Holden took on a new role, training the pack's younger warriors, careful to teach them that loyalty meant honesty, not silence. Chelsea Benson returned from the distant outpost to help rebuild the Records Hall's healing station, alongside a humbled but determined Rebecca Daniels. And Courtney Crawford, slowly, carefully, began to find her own voice again, writing her daughter long letters, full of the words she had once been too afraid to say aloud. Paige Hawkins, too, found her way back into Felicia's life, though it took longer than either of them expected, and required an honest conversation. Neither had been ready for that first morning in the Records Hall. Standing once more beneath the old oak tree by the river, the two of them finally spoke the truth they had both avoided for so long, and though their friendship would never look quite the same as it had in childhood, something steadier and more honest grew in its place. Felicia herself never stopped keeping records, though her work now carried a different weight than it once had. She began, quietly at first, documenting the testimonies of others across the territories who had once been silenced the way she had, building, page by page, a different kind of ledger entirely, one meant not to bury the truth, but to keep it safe for good. She had whispered her truth for 23 days before anyone listened. She would never have to whisper it alone again.